Hello, welcome to the Charity Impact Podcast, the in-depth podcast for people working in the charity sector or more broadly to achieve social impact. I'm Alex Blake, your podcast host, and I'm joined today by Annie Legg from Project to discuss digital resilience, the funding landscape for digital projects, tech for good initiatives, convening networks, and running a cooperative. Annie has worked in digital since the 1990s with international experience across startups, SMEs, global brands, and social impact organisations. Thanks to previous guest Emma Beeston for the introduction. If you listen to the podcast, you'll have heard me asking if you could help get the word out by rating or following on your podcast player or sharing our posts on email or social media. So I'd just like to thank those of you who have been. I've seen posts recently from Howard Lake, Mark Longbottom, Annie Constable, Dave Terrace, North East Young Dads and Lads Charity, the New System Alliance, and not to mention lots of other people who have liked and retweeted and reshared our posts. I really appreciate it personally, and more importantly, I think our guests are sharing such valuable insights, experiences, tips and resources that the more people who find out about the podcast, the better. And we've got some great guests booked in for the next couple of months. So if you'd like to find out who they are and have the opportunity to submit a question for me to ask, you'll need to subscribe to our free emails via the banner at the top of our website. So welcome to the podcast, Annie. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. And thanks for having me.
Awesome. No problem. Looking forward to bringing my digital knowledge a bit further up to speed after we had a recent episode with Ross McCulloch, who took us through a load of stuff around digital capabilities for charities. So first of all, do you want to just tell us a little bit about the work that you do at Project, just to give us that context?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm Annie, one of the co-founders of Project. So Project, we are a social enterprise, we're a non-profit, and we work exclusively with social organisations, primarily that means charities. And what we're doing is really advancing their digital resilience so that they're best equipped to support society. And I think it might be helpful for me to define what we mean by digital resilience for us. That's really about the organisation's ability to engage with change, so withstanding disruption using digital to maintain their operations, but as well as prepare for and take advantage of the way the environment is constantly changing. And we do that primarily through sort of two different levers, and that's how we like to kind of explain it. One is the sort of technology side, which is really about looking at the strategy, the digital strategy, the systems that the organisation has, and the way in which data supports the organisation. And then alongside that, we're always looking from a team's perspective. And to us, that's really about building the confidence, the collaborative structures, and also the governance practices within the organisation. And to us, it's the combination of these together that really is all about digital resilience. So we work directly with charities, but we also work alongside funders, helping them to design and implement funding that's specifically around digital for the charity sector.
Yeah, great. And I wanted to ask you about that, just looking at that sort of funding landscape for digital projects. Can you sort of share what your experience has been around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed enormously. So we launched Project back in 2016. And one of the things we'd really observed at that time was there was a lot of funding for sort of building new things. So building new tools, new systems. And it seemed to me that there was a lot of repetition as well. So different sectors building similar technologies. I think what we really felt was there was a kind of missing gap between about actually digital within the organization itself. So having those kind of strong foundations and knowing how to engage and work with technology before you then go and invest in building something new. Because I think one of the real challenges is then, once you have new digital products, you've got to look after them. So it seemed that there was a lot of funding around the building of the new, but much, much less around actually that kind of core digital resilience piece that I was just talking about.
Yeah, because it's no good having the shiny new system if no one knows how to use it properly, and then people don't put the data in correctly and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, I mean, what have you found in terms of the sort of funding and support that's available at the moment, and what's that typically look like? What are charities able to access?
Yes, I guess the real change started to happen during COVID. when suddenly there was a lot of funding around digital, that kind of really obvious recognition that actually nothing can happen unless we do some things digitally. So we saw a lot of funding come out during that couple of years, really. And that was quite flexible funding, funding for obviously building a new digital like websites, digital services and products. But also we started to really see that kind of more widespread recognition of it also being about digital skills, it being about actually, do you have the right infrastructure, like the right tech, the right IT? Do you have laptops? Do you have all the systems that you need for people to be remote working? So there was a lot of funding. They were quite short term, and a lot of it was just kind of quite one-off, I suppose, in terms of those kind of couple of years. And I think we were really, really hopeful that would kind of be a fundamental shift, that actually there was a recognition that funding for digital needs to be around core capacity building, as well as actually building new things and new digital services. But I think what we've really noticed, particularly in the last maybe 9 months or so, I'd say, is that it's really, really hard to find the digital funding again. It seems to be that priorities have shifted. Quite obviously, you have a cost of living crisis as well. There's a lot of challenges that organisations and funders indeed are facing as well. But from the charities that we speak to, they're finding it really difficult to find the right types of funding, particularly around this kind of core capacity strengthening work, the types of work that we obviously do at Dot Project.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there's less funding specifically for digital projects. Lately, I know, as you said, there were kind of a few grant programs that were specifically for digital, and so I suppose it's often difficult, I think, for charities to pitch digital projects to funders who often are not sort of digitally focused and don't have that kind of background themselves. So it's harder for them to kind of understand it in comparison to a more sort of traditional service delivery type application, or even the kind of core funding proposals that are just kind of setting out the overall work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because it really, from our experience and the relationships that we've built with funders as well, you really need to have that understanding within the funder of the difference that's going to make to the organisation, particularly also about giving that kind of flexibility, I suppose, to the charity themselves to know what they need in terms of that digital strengthening piece. There are some very innovative funders out there, some very flexible funders, but they're also very hard to find. One thing that I actually researched quite recently, I was looking in again at, where there were some digital priorities amongst funders, but also looking at like corporate foundations, sort of smaller and larger ones. But actually what I noticed was, particularly the larger foundations, for example, are often, they don't accept sort of inbound inquiries, if you like. And so that makes it really, really difficult to, get yourself heard. But also the sort of smaller foundations that may be a little bit more flexible are also really hard to find, and to really understand what their priorities are as well. So I think it's really hard for charities to actually navigate that funder landscape, because it is shifting all the time as well. I think there's the obvious big, the sort of ones that everybody's heard of, like Comic Relief and National Lottery, and they've done amazing work from a digital perspective. But I guess their priorities will be shifting as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know, for example, with the lottery, they had one or a couple of big sort of digital programs, didn't they? But once they're closed, then it's kind of the business as usual stuff doesn't have any clearly kind of digital focus there. It's so I think, yeah, again, it's one of those where you look at it and you think, are they interested in proposals that are about digital projects? Because there's nothing to suggest that they are, but their sort of main open programs are quite broad in their criteria, and there are probably lots of sort of trusts and foundations that fit into that as well. They've got, they're kind of saying to applicants, you tell us what you need, but are they open to those sort of digital projects? I think it's quite difficult for charities to kind of take that risk of pitching that when that's, it maybe feels like a higher risk than alternatives.
Yeah, but I guess, the ideal future is going to be when, digital is part of every single project.
Yeah, so I
Any
suppose wrapping it into,
organisation
yeah.
does. And I think what, definitely with the National Lottery, they've been obviously particularly focused on digital for quite a long time. So I do think that they are one of the funders who will, are sort of quite open to the digital aspects of the projects that you might be looking to implement. Less sure about some of the smaller ones necessarily, but I think certainly with like the digital fund, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, we've worked on a few of these different programs. And I think they are a lot more understanding now of actually digital is inherently part of anything you're going to be doing. I think the challenge comes from when it's all about the project funding. And that's the bit that we find really, really challenging, because digital is ongoing. I mean, even from your personal life that you constantly have to update your phones, you constantly have to update your laptops and your networks and all of these things. It's just the same, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you're working in a charity as well, these things have to be looked after. People have to have the skills and the right technical knowledge to make some of those decisions. And it's like having, I often refer to it, it's like having a child. once you've got that in place, you've got to look after it like anything else, like your building itself.
Yeah. And I suppose when you're applying to those large funders, if you're going to someone like the lottery and you're pitching for maybe 100k a year, then you can kind of wrap in those digital costs. You can get the cost of maybe buying something in, and maybe getting some of that kind of capacity building support in there as well within that kind of 100k cost. Whereas with some of the smaller sort of funders, it's you can't necessarily wrap in all of those costs because there's just not enough scale there.
I think it's also there about the time that what we have done a lot of advocacy around as well is the amount of time it takes to ramp up for quite significant digital projects. In order to apply for funding, obviously you get as many quotes as you can and you try and look and see how long the project's going to take and what partners you might work with. But it takes a really long time to actually get those things in place. Once you have the funding and you're able to move forward with your project, there's often very little time built in for organizations to start their projects and actually do that really important groundwork, which includes things like, contracts, getting multiple quotes, really trying to understand what your, the partnership that you're setting up. And it's the same actually at the other end of the project. It's actually what's actually going to make this project sustainable now. What do we need to do ongoing? What's our kind of longer term commitments?
Yeah, and in your work with funders, have you delivered support as part of those kind of grants plus type programs where the funder provides a grant and then they also provide some consultancy support from a provider like yourselves? Have you been involved in some of those types of projects?
Yeah, actually most often we have. So National Lottery Digital Funds, we were a partner on that fund as well as supporting a number of the organisations through their digital grants. And again, most recently with Comic Relief, one of their programmes funded by the Ministry of Justice. Obviously, they were giving significant grants actually to about 20 organisations within the sexual abuse and domestic violence sector. And we were brought in as a partner to help obviously design, the application process and the design of the delivery programme, but then actually be, I guess, subject matter experts, if you like, in terms of working alongside those organisations who had, in that case, very little time to make a lot of changes. So that's just another example of where there's a desperate need, and particularly in that sector. But, going faster isn't always the right way either. So it's having that kind of nice balance.
Yeah, it's difficult with some of those sorts of programs as well, where sometimes you've kind of got a chunk of days where you can work with an organisation over a relatively short period of time. And it's, as you say, it's more about that kind of longer term change and that more sustainable change.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we really hope to see. We've been doing quite a lot of advocacy around that, but, really hopeful that it won't be too long before there's longer term funding. We're talking 2-3 years to really help an organisation understand where they are now, make the right priorities from a digital perspective that's deeply aligned to their organisational strategy, that is actually manageable by the size of the team, the capacity that they have, and then really kind of embed that change much more longer term so that the whole organization shifts. And I'm talking particularly around smaller to medium-sized organizations who often lack the sort of technology and the digital and the IT skills internally, or they often maybe just have one person in that role and rely on external partners. But really, this is all around quite long-term change and doing it slowly, diligently, sustainably.
Yeah.
We're working on a program at the moment, actually, that's funded by an organization called Okta. It's their Tech for Good program. Okta are a cybersecurity software organization. They're based out in the States, but kind of work globally. And actually the work with them, we're doing it in partnership with Charity Digital. What we've been doing for the last year is helping a number of organizations, actually working with a team from each organization to help them build a digital strategy. And then we've just been funded for a second year to help those organizations start to embed that digital strategy whilst also meeting some of their more urgent, technology priorities. And that really gives you a sense of actually how long it takes to really work alongside them.
Yeah, I think that's what's really needed, isn't it? I know we've both kind of said that from a funder perspective, what's generally always needed is as unrestricted as possible and as long as possible, and usually as much as possible as well. But when charities have received unrestricted funding, do you find, I don't know if you get a sense of this from your perspective, are organizations prioritizing digital as something that they need, when they have got that flexibility with their funding, that they're then seeing that as a priority to invest in and reaching out to people like yourselves to get support with that?
Yeah, I guess mixed. We haven't often seen a lot of unrestricted funding in the types of organizations that we typically have been working with. But then when the funding, to your point, when there is funding around actually that kind of core capacity strengthening, it definitely is something. That's when we get those inbound, I guess, inquiries around actually now I can start really making sense of how digital needs to be a priority for us as a charity. Where do we even start? What happens next? And really helping them kind of build out that roadmap for that journey. But yes, I think it definitely is a priority, and it's a mix of skills, strategy, but also, having the right infrastructure. It's quite fundamental, having the right tools, having the right physical devices. And it's not just laptops. Often it's actually their connectivity, or it's actually a lot of services are delivered out on the road. So actually, how do we have the right devices to support us with that? So it's a really big mix.
Yeah. You mentioned the term Tech for Good just before, and I thought it'd be worth digging into Tech for Good a bit more, but maybe starting by defining what that means, because it feels a bit like it's one of those terms that lots of people use in lots of different ways.
Yeah, they do. And I think, so I guess my role within Tech for Good has always been stewarding a local community network called Tech for Good Southwest, which is based primarily around the sort of Bath, Bristol region. And really, Tech for Good to us is about the intentional use of technology to drive positive outcomes for people and planet. So it's really, really broad. And I think probably the way that we think about it from a Tech for Good Southwest perspective is in one pillar, if you like, it's around digital in charities. So it's everything that we've just been talking about. It's the skills, the confidence, it's training, mentoring, but primarily bringing the tech sector and the charity sector together to really kind of help support, driving digital in charities. It's also about particular technology challenges around the kind of the positive outcomes piece. So it's about ethics. So ethics in AI is a good example. It's about technology skills, women in tech, diversity, green tech, all these sort of actual technology challenges. And then I think finally, it's also around, for me, particularly from a community perspective, it's about regional collaboration. So actually, how can we really have a cross-sector approach to think about some of these challenges, to think about the digital divide, to think about digital skills in young people, older people, charities, and really have that kind of collaboration.
And are there some examples that you could share, perhaps in terms of how technology is impacting on some of the sort of big societal issues, whether that's sort of climate or mental health or any number of things, I suppose, that the sort of charity sector will be looking at, examples of technology, maybe by charities and social enterprises, but maybe by for-profit startups and so on as well?
Yeah, so firstly, actually, from a Tech for Good Southwest perspective, Bristol and Bath are, we have a big tech sector here, and obviously further southwest as well. So the community is also really focused on Tech for Good business, so Tech for Good startups, making sure that actually, we have as many people thinking about Tech for Good within the lens of what they do is really, really fundamental. And so that's when you start to see a little bit of a crossover, I suppose, between the focus of a social enterprise doing Tech for Good that might be, for example, building mindfulness apps or like ecology that has that kind of carbon footprinting tool, to actually, digital in charities from a digital services perspective. So one example might be like the British Red Cross. They have a first aid app. That's a good example of a kind of piece of Tech for Good, really clearly supporting individual general public, really. And Access Social Care actually is one of the organizations we've been working alongside. They have a chatbot tool that supports access to free legal advice, and they're really, really scaling that at the moment just to try and really extend their reach. So you can start to see there's lots and lots of different ways technology can start to address some of the societal challenges. But the flip side of that is technology is also a problem. And, I mentioned around AI and actually the sort of ethical use of AI being quite a big topic that's in the papers, for example, and in the news. These are the things that we also need to think about. We also need to think about how maybe digital is leaving people behind. We have a big challenge in, Bath is a very small place, but actually we have huge deprivation in parts of the city as well, and yet we have huge wealth in parts of the city. And actually it's one of those places where the digital divide is really, really obvious. And so actually, how can we, one of the projects actually that we are focusing on is how can we come together as a city? It's a very small city, but how can we come together to address these challenges? What can we do in schools? How can we support parents? How can we support teachers and carers? So yeah, these are sort of some of the kind of broad challenges that we might sort of discuss from a Tech for Good perspective.
Hi, please excuse this brief interruption. I'd love for more people in our sector to hear from our guests, so I'd like to ask a favour of you, please. If you're enjoying the podcast, please could you promote the show in whatever way suits you. This could be giving us a rating and following us on your podcast player, or following us and sharing posts on social media, or telling your contacts about us by email. Any of those would be a great help and greatly appreciated. And most importantly, thank you for listening. And so what's the focus for the Tech for Good Southwest community? What sort of things are the network getting involved in?
Yeah, so we actually probably a bit of a history, as we started off as Tech for Good Bath, and we did that because we found that the only conversations that were happening from a sort of community perspective generally around Tech for Good were all in London. So we wanted to do something a little bit more local, but also there is a international network of Tech for Good communities, and we really wanted to also be part of a more global community and be aware of other conversations that were happening not just in our region, not just in the UK, but also more broadly than that. A community set up around the same time in Bristol, and after a couple of years, we worked very closely together. Running communities is really hard, and organizing, volunteer communities is just takes time. So we decided to join up together and have a sort of Tech for Good Southwest focus that would also really encourage us to champion these conversations, further across the Southwest in Devon and Cornwall and further north of Bristol. And I guess what we're really focused on, particularly right now, is sort of surfacing stories of Tech for Good. So we have training and learning events. An example might be some learning events specifically targeted at charities. So it could be around the latest release of Google Analytics, or it could be how to use a particular CRM, or how to make the best out of your CRM data, or something quite specific. We also have events that are more around sharing insights and knowledge. So sometimes those might be more thematic. So it could be how to support young people with digital skills, for example. And then we would bring a few different speakers together for that. And then ultimately it is about convening. So it's convening different skills, different sectors. So we have, good engagement from our councils, from the combined authority based in Bristol, and bringing that together with our tech sector, our tech recruiters, and with charities to really try and learn from each other, but also problem solve together, because I deeply believe that's where, change can really happen with that regional collaboration. So practically what we do is have events. We've had a little bit less physical events recently because they are a bit more difficult to guarantee, getting people out. It's still a bit of a hangover, I think, from the COVID couple of years. We've got our website, we've got a newsletter where we're really trying to sort of surface not just what's happening regionally, but actually some interesting Tech for Good news from across the UK. And also recently launched our own podcast as a way to really have quite short stories that were very diverse from across the region that was related to Tech for Good. So actually people working in charities, but also people running Tech for Good startups, or how do we find funding regionally for digital skills development, for example. So really trying to use the podcast as a way of actually getting much more momentum and surfacing actually some incredible individuals, incredible organizations, and really, really deeply impactful projects that the region is trying to work through.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the sort of regional networks in terms of what's the difference now since COVID in terms of actually getting people to events and things, because I think as you said, there's a real power there in convening different organizations and individuals and bringing people together, and that's where sort of magic really happens, isn't it? And particularly for something like that, where obviously the sort of the digital aspect of it, the learning aspect can all be kind of virtual, and in a way there's sort of less of a regional focus there, because it could be relevant to anyone anywhere, but that bit about bringing people together, you really need to do more in person than on a sort of Zoom session. So yeah, I think it's a challenge for those sorts of networks, isn't it? Because I think people now think, oh well, I can just jump on a Zoom call or a webinar or something and kind of get what I need from it in, a kind of 60-90 minute thing during the day, rather than having to travel somewhere and spend some of my evening at a networking event and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I think, we all inherently know that it's not the same as being in person. So what we're trying to do is really, where it's perhaps more of a sort of showcase or learning type event, we just do those online, keep them quite short, and then keep the kind of in-person events as really actually you travel to be here. You obviously want to be with other people, to network with other people, to kind of make sense of things and chat through things. So have that as more of convening style events. We ran a unconference last May back in Bristol, and that's really, for those of you that don't know about unconferences, it's really where there is no agenda, but we co-create the agenda with the people in the room. So you obviously have to have some facilitation for that, but people bring what topics they want to talk about, and then you kind of co-create the agenda together. And what's really special about that is that you've got a voice, so you know that you're going to have really a chance to participate, to find other people interested in the same topics that you are. And we had about probably 80, 100 people at that unconference. And there was such a diversity in terms of the conversations, all the things I mentioned earlier. Some people really interested in, technology volunteering, some people really interested in funding and how do we make that work better. Some people really interested in, accessibility and diversity in tech. So these conversations being so broad. But as you say, it's the convening that's where the magic is. Yeah. And actually, I think it's about a couple of years ago now, a few of us that run Tech for Good communities across the UK, there's probably, off the top of my head, there's probably about 15 or so kind of Tech for Good communities. And a group of us came together actually to launch a Tech for Good organisers network, so that we could actually be a support network for each other and sort of share and learn and, you know, cross-pollinate, I guess, as well, in terms of actually that, particularly if you've got online sessions, it doesn't, you don't have to be based in Bristol and Bath, you can be anywhere to attend those. And that's been really, really helpful. We actually all had a retreat a couple of weeks ago. Actually, there were 30 people or so at that retreat who were all running, you know, affiliated, you know, related to the kind of Tech for Good theme, if you like, across the UK. And that, you know, that was really, we had all the conversations there around actually, how do you measure impact of convening? How do you actually, you know, make sure that your events are going to be, you know, both accessible, but also actually that people are going to turn up? Do you charge people? Do you not charge people? All these sorts of questions, I guess, we muddle over a little bit together, and some we don't really have answers to. We just have to go with gut instinct a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
No, I'd love to have my magic wand, is really trying to be able to, you know, really demonstrate and prove the impact of convening in this way around Tech for Good. And that's, you know, we're still working on that. It's just really hard. You know that you have deep impacts from what people are doing as a result of having been part of your network. But that's really hard to justify, and then, you know, get, I guess, financial support as well for these types of communities.
Yeah, it's really difficult to evaluate, isn't it, and to come up with some kind of clear outcomes where you can really get the causality between the links and that sort of thing. And yeah, funding those types of networks is really tricky, isn't it, in terms of making that case. Out of interest, with your unconference where you had 100 people or so there, did you charge people to attend with that one, or did you have any funding for it?
Yeah, interesting. We didn't charge, we haven't ever charged anyone before, so we've still got a bit of a block around whether to do that or not, but so we didn't for that event. And we did have some sponsorship for the venue, but also for a facilitator, because, you know, that's really, really key for these more convening style events. Is, you know, it can obviously be one of us as an organizing team, but actually depending on what outcome you're trying to achieve, you know, actually you need to really invest in that careful design and facilitation of those events. And what I found, particularly in this region, is, for example, you know, the councils are combined, you know, West of England Combined Authority, they deeply get that convening is really fundamental and really, really important. So they are often the types of funders who will fund that type of event, where it's a little bit harder to get more commercial sponsorship for those types of events, when, you know, actually they often want a bit more of a presence and want to be a bit more visible at those type of events. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult with those things as well, where you want to maximize the number of people that are there, so that, and, you know, if you charge, then that will reduce the numbers. It's just kind of inevitable, isn't it?
Or getting that price point where, you know, people have made a little bit of a commitment so that they do turn up. We're doing a bit of an experiment actually this year. We have quite a strong digital festival that runs. We have one in Bristol and one that runs in Bath. We've got a Bath Digital Festival in July. And so rather than really focusing on regular events through the year, we're actually putting our energy into having a Tech for Good theme across the week of the Bath Digital Festival, which is in July. And that's really exciting, because that's actually, you know, there's a lot of conversations around a lot of different things. Actually, how can we activate some of these groups to really bring that to the digital festival, so that we are having more of a purposeful conversation alongside, obviously, potentially more commercial conversations at the festival, or case studies, if you like. So we've got a number of events that we are looking to kind of help put together, and then get sponsorship, obviously, for those different events. And one of them, just to give you an example, is a charity digital surgery. We've run a couple of these in the past, actually, but this one, you know, we've got a good amount of time to also make sure we can fill the room with charities, but also with our local tech expertise as well, to really have a sort of whole morning of Q&A, and, you know, have experts across the sort of technology skill set to really be there to answer questions and provide, I guess, next steps and a bit of guidance for organisations that are in the room. So I think that's great. That's a collaboration with our local Baines 3SG, which is our third sector membership organisation, and also with some of the tech skills networks that we have across Bath and Bristol. We've also recently had the launch of Technology Volunteers from Bristol. It's actually a relaunch. It's technologyvolunteers.org. And that's really a place that brings together charity projects looking for volunteers, but also obviously a place for tech skills and tech people to sign up to do that volunteering. I know there's a few of these types of things that already exist, but it's really lovely to see that come out of Bristol particularly, and that actually being something we can really signpost people onto. That's one of the challenges we've had in the past is, yes, we're a Tech for Good network, and yes, we really want to support particularly the charity sector, but actually running that kind of level of volunteering and connecting is it needs a big system beneath it really, and it needs capacity to run it. So I think that's really exciting, because it means things like this charity digital surgery, there'll be somewhere for people to go on to and not just left after that session at the festival.
And I think it's an obvious area where you can get some really high impact volunteering, isn't it, when you've got people with those digital skills that are really able to lend that expertise to charities looking at developing those sort of digital projects or getting those sort of foundational elements in place.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to ask you as well a bit about Dot Project, just your experience of setting up as a cooperative and working with that model, and how you've tried different ways of working and how you think about sustaining your own organisation and the services you deliver, and how you can best meet the needs of the charities you're supporting and so on. So what's been your experience since you've set up, and what you've tried, what you've learned?
We've learned a lot. So back in 2016, when we founded Dot Projects, we at that time as well, we wanted to design the organisation in a way that felt it was sort of sustainable, but actually worked in a much more democratic way. So we did set up early on as a cooperative, be it only 2 of us at the time. But what we really felt passionate about was actually everybody who works on a project makes it happen, and that actually whatever your skills are, we're all equal in terms of actually getting the projects and getting the work out of the door. And that was really important for us. I think we also really wanted to design an organisation that felt very supportive, that actually really championed at the time, particularly around women in tech. It was a big conversation around having more women, having more diversity. I think it's moved on so fast over the last few years since then. We really wanted to champion that, and we really wanted to show that we could do it or demonstrate that we could do it in a different way, and design an organisation that felt really close to us and part of us, that was there for us. And that's really, we chose the cooperative model because that felt like it really fitted for us. And essentially what that means is the members of Dot Project, I guess, own and run the business. Nobody really owns it. We don't have shareholding. We can't sell the business as such. But what we do is co-organize and co-run Dot Project. And over the years, we've really sort of grown and shrunk and grown and shrunk. And often we've been ramping up for some of the bigger programs. We talked earlier about some of the funder programs that we've been working on, and that's often required us to really scale and grow actually our membership particularly. And I think that was probably one of the things we've learned with hindsight now, is that we did some of that growth too quickly. Because I think, actually having responsibility for organising operationally a business is really hard and takes time alongside the project delivery, and it's not always something that everybody wants to be involved with. So I think that's been one of the learnings, that maybe as members we might have grown a little bit slower. But I guess the way we work now is much more of an associate model. So actually we have quite a small membership team now, but we obviously work with a lot of freelancers and other organisations that come regularly to just support the delivery of our projects with their specific skill sets. we're a non-profit as well. I think that fits really well in terms of actually the types of work that we do, the communities that we support as well. I think that's been something that the charities particularly have really valued, in terms of feeling that, you know, actually we're sort of in it for the impact as well, and actually really sitting alongside them. So we've definitely iterated over the years more in terms of actually how our membership operates, and also our ways of working. We've predominantly been digital first anyway. We used to run a lot of our workshops in person. We then had to pivot and do all of that online. It's really taking its time actually to get those back in person again. And we know that the work is done quicker if we have more in-person time. So that can actually be quite a challenge from a budgeting perspective, because you feel if you're delivering online, it's actually going to cost less, but often it doesn't, because people can't sustain huge amounts of time working, for example, in workshops online.
Right.
I think one of the challenges that we've always had from the outset, and particularly working alongside charity sector, working alongside funders, is how much to charge, I guess, and how much it costs to do the work. So often when you're working on, you know, for National Lottery or some of the larger public sector funders, is you do have a cap on your day rate anyway.
Yeah.
And then, but what that means is that we're obviously bringing in other specialist organisations and other freelancers to essentially deliver at, you know, very low day rates, I suppose. And I'm talking particularly about tech skills as well, and actually what the demand is for them in the private sector. And we've been on a mission really to try and get as many freelancers and associates as we can to work alongside us, because we deeply need their skills. But actually, it's also really difficult to find anybody that's purely working in this sector and not actually balancing that with more commercial work in order to balance obviously their income particularly. So I think that's just been one of the challenges that we've really had to battle with over the years, is the price point and making sure that our work is accessible. We're very, very passionate about supporting small, particularly smaller charities who lack those skills internally, that need the time, need the mentoring, and need that support longer term. But actually doing lots of those at low day rates is actually an organizational challenge. So yeah. I don't think we ever fully crack it. We've tried to look at funding, to have funding ourselves. We've also looked at getting investment, which is very difficult if you're a cooperative and you don't essentially have shares, I guess, and ways of actually providing benefit to your investors other than social benefits. We've looked at getting funding for Dot Project to deliver our work as well, and was looking hopeful, but then with the way that the economy's gone over the last year, that's now much more tricky to access as well. So I think for now, what we've done is really try and create as lean model as possible in order to be able to support the organisations that we want to support at a cost that is valued to the organisation, but is enough to get them where they need to go next.
Are there any particular resources or organisations or anything that you'd recommend people check out if they want to learn a bit more about whether it's either the tech for good side of things or the sort of charity digital capabilities or the potential sort of funding landscape or any of those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot out there. I think it is quite difficult sometimes to make sense of them and where they are. Yeah. I mean, I think you've probably mentioned it on another episode, but the Catalyst, so the catalyst.org.uk, there's so many resources in there, and also a lot of signposting. So resources including things like how to write a digital brief, and signposting also onto lots of other either volunteering programs or other kind of specialist networks. One of them actually that I've always found been involved with as well in the past is really useful is Dovetail, and that's part of Catalyst as well. It's called, I think the website is dovetail.network, and that is essentially a network or it's a portal really with a list of digital agencies or website developers, that type, or digital communications agencies that particularly work in the charity sector. And what's really helpful is that you can just scan and see what kind of day rates they have, what level of projects that they typically will take on. And I think that's really, really important, because you waste time sending. We've had some feedback recently that we heard in another network of where I think a particular brief that came out from a charity had something like 60 different people respond to it, which is not sustainable for a charity to actually then think, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
So I think that really helps to look at actually what's the size of your project, and not approaching agencies that just don't work at the sort of smaller budgets. There's lots of emerging sort of volunteering and I think advice spaces. So there's Digital Candle that have the free, I think it's 1 hour calls. So you'll have lots of tech volunteers that have offered just to give their time to chat through any questions that you might have as a charity. And then I think there's, things like technology volunteers that I just mentioned is a relative new one, but there's also some quite well-established reach volunteering networks like that really help connect charities with experts. So yeah, I think those are a few. I think one of the things I would obviously really promote is getting involved with any of the Tech for Good networks or communities that might be where you're based, or if you're just interested obviously in kind of being part of that world. There are lots of virtual communities as well, like digitalcharities.org. That's a great community for people that are in digital roles in charities. I don't think that there are obviously some larger charities represented in there, but I don't think it's all specifically larger organizations. They're just a few that kind of come to mind.
Yeah. And if people are looking for those Tech for Good communities near them, is there like a central sort of website where you can find a list of them, or do you just have to kind of do a bit of Googling and digging around?
You can definitely do the Googling and digging around, but what we've tried to do in Tech for Good organisers, so that is techforgoodorganisers.uk, is really try to start to surface all of those different networks, because some of them won't, not many are even called Tech for Good, for example. Some of them will be called like Digital for Good, or sort of Tech Soup, which is actually the international network I referred to earlier. So some will be called that as well. But that, if you go to techforgoodorganisers.uk, you should start to see some of the ones that we've been able to surface as community organisers ourselves.
Right. Well, thank you, Annie. That has been really fascinating insight into all things Tech for Good and Charity Digital. Was there anything else that you wanted to share before we finish, or any requests of the listeners or any potential audience?
I think just get involved, particularly with local networks. I think what we're really seeing, and I'm observing in Bath, Bristol, for example, is there's just quite a surge in, particularly from the tech sector, people that just want to volunteer their time, people who want to get involved with local initiatives, and particularly with a lot of remote working that people are doing now. I'm really sensing that people want to be involved on the ground where they live in community initiatives and projects. So I think if you are one of those people, then definitely just get in touch with your local charity networks or volunteering networks. But also if you're a charity as well, there are so many people out there that want to help you, but appreciate obviously takes time as well. So I think maybe go through some of those advice resources that I mentioned, and actually just see what's happening locally, and see if you can get involved with your local tech networks as well. I think there's just such an opportunity when we come together to kind of support each other, to learn, to share resources. It's impossible to keep on top of everything, particularly in the sort of digital landscape. You're never going to know all the answers. It's such a massive, huge field, and it's actually part of everything that we do now. So you're never going to know all the answers, and that's okay. But somebody probably very near you does.
Yeah. I think the first step is working out what the question is, isn't it? Before you even think about what the answers might be.
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks, Annie. Thanks so much for coming on. That's been great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Charity Impact Podcast. Please give us a rating and follow us on your podcast player or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook. And if you think this episode would be of interest to someone in your network, please do share the webpage on social media or by email.